Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Camp Theater. I hope you have a great time at Modernism Week 2023. Before I hand over the microphone to our presenter, Diane Wilk, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones. Thank you very much and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, and wow, it's a big crowd. This is great. As she said, my name is Diane Wilk. Thank you for coming. And I grew up spending my summers in Lake Arrowhead as a kid, and I was so amazed by all this incredible architecture that I was surrounded by that I decided I wanted to be an architect. Now, so I did. Now, the write-up for Modernism Week bills me as someone who met Paul Williams as a kid. I wish that were true, but that's fake news, just as it's fake news as when we had a home tour, I was introduced by one of the docents as having worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, that would have been great, but Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959. I would have been 4 years old. I guess I'm a prodigy. What can I say? Anyway, my architectural mentors were not Paul Williams, but it was Pierre Koenig, A. Quincy Jones, Caesar Pelli, Tony Lumsden, Jim Sterling, and Aldo Rossi. So I kind of have my modernist chops, but the work I'm doing now isn't exactly purely modernist, but that's another, you'll see that later on. Anyway, in one point in my career, I taught architectural design and history at the University of Colorado, but I left academia about 25 years ago for the real world, and I've been in practice with my husband here for the last 25 years. Even though I gave up teaching, I love research. So this is kind of a culmination of about 15 years of research on Lake Arrowhead. And there's a book coming out on April 3rd. I'm sorry I don't have it with me now. But if you go online, look up Lake Arrowhead architecture, and I think Amazon carries it. Anyway, if you're not familiar with Lake Arrowhead and its connection to Palm Springs, I'm going to start this lecture giving you a brief history, showing you where Lake Arrowhead is. I'll touch briefly on the Victorian period, the period revival architecture, and try to set the context for the world's first modern A-frame, 1934-1936. And I'm also going to show you the other stuff that was being built in Arrowhead at that same time, including Paul Williams. And I'm going to show you some Paul Williams buildings that I know you've never seen before, because I had never seen it. Paul Williams was designing buildings with thatched roofs. I think there's one photograph existing, and I'm going to show that to you. Anyway, that'll bring us to the war years, and nothing happened in the war years in terms of architecture. And so I'll get into the 50s, and as you guessed it, what was happening in Arrowhead had a totally different flavor than what was happening anywhere else. And then into the 60s, when mid-century modernism is in full swing. So we'll touch upon those, and then move on to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and end up with what I think is going on now, and take a guess towards the future. It's a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to be quick. I recorded myself, and the presentation was 1:33. So I said, this isn't going to work, so I cut out about 30, 40 slides, and I re-recorded it, and I chopped off 1 minute. So I went back to the drawing board, and I chopped off another 50 slides, and I hope I'm closer to 1 hour. I don't know. I might get sidetracked. I tend to do that. But if you need to get up and leave, I won't be offended. Just go. But hopefully it'll be interesting enough that you'll want to stay for the whole thing. Anyway, Lake Arrowhead is located up in the mountains between, and let's see how this works. Okay, here's Lake Arrowhead. Palm Springs is about 75 miles from Arrowhead. LA is about 75 miles from Arrowhead. This is where all the orange groves were. And this is the main road, historically, from the Port of LA, Southern California, to Salt Lake City. Now, after California became a state in 1850, about 500 Mormons settled in the San Bernardino Valley because it was a great stopping point between California and Salt Lake. And they looked up and they saw trees on the ridge and they said, hey, we can use that to build our settlement. And it took them 2 weeks to build the precursor to Highway 18, all the way up the mountain. And that was the start of logging on the mountain. And they named their settlement San Bernardino. But the Mormons didn't stay very long. By 1857, Brigham Young said, hey, you all need to come back to Utah. And some of them went and some of them stayed. But then there was the 7.9 Fort Tejon earthquake. And the stragglers said, oh, maybe that's a sign from God, we better head back to Utah. So all the Mormons left. That same year, somebody brought 3 sweet citrus trees from the San Gabriel Mission and planted them in the San Bernardino Valley. And that is the beginnings of the citrus industry in the Inland Empire. And by 1883, the southern leg of the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and by 1885, it reached the San Bernardino Valley. Now, by 1889, they came up with refrigerated cars, and the first fruit from California made its way to New York City. And this was a huge deal, because by 1895, and this is a photo from 1895, the Welcome Arch in Riverside, it made Riverside the highest per capita income in the entire United States because of the amount of citrus. They started with 3 trees 43 years earlier, and by 1900, there were 5.5 million citrus growing in California. So the citrus farmers needed a steady supply of water. And they started looking to the mountains, and they built a couple of reservoirs. The first, I think, one of the first was in Big Bear, and that supplied water to Redlands. And in 1891 or so, a group of Ohio investors, and the president was James Gamble. He invented ivory soap, and his brother built the Gamble House in Pasadena, decided to start construction on a dam in Little Bear Valley. And you see here a train. They hauled these engines up the mountain with oxen. And there was actually a train that ran along the ridge. Now, the road up the mountain that was originally built to carry the lumber down now is used as the road up the mountain, and they would come in on horses and in buggies like this to the rich citrus farmers wanted to get out of the heat of the valley and go fish in the reservoir that was being built and just have some recreation on the mountain. This was the beginning of tourism. And in 1892, the same year that the Sierra Club was founded, they founded a club and a resort called the Squirrel Inn. And all the movers and shakers in the valley would come up to the Squirrel Inn, and they must have had a really good time, because, you know, I like this photo here with the guy with the rifle pointing at the guy reading a book, and then these guys over here pretending that they're cowhands. Anyway, these were the decision makers from the Inland Empire, and they would hold meetings trying to figure out what to do with the series of reservoirs they had. So here's a picture of the inside, and they'd have their meetings, and then they'd play cards, drink booze, and of course, guns must have just added to the festivities. But, not to be outdone, the women, too, had fun with their guns. And here we see some women in their high-heeled shoes skeet shooting at, this is the dam. This is probably from the 1920s. They didn't allow cars up until about 1909 because they were afraid that cars would scare the horses and they'd fall off the mountain. But anyway, I guess all of this, they had to protect themselves from all the pesky squirrels that were up there. And here we see the squirrels that they would put on display at the Squirrel Inn. Starting at 1893, this goes all the way up to 1905, and they would shoot a squirrel, stuff it, and have a little ceremony, and that marked the beginning of the recreational season of the year. This brings us to 1909 and the establishment of Pinecrest Resort. This is Dr. John Bayless. He worked for the railroad, and there was 160 acres immediately next door to the Squirrel Inn that became available. And he talked to his buddies and said, hey, let's buy this and save these trees from logging. And they said, nah, we're having too much fun, gambling and playing with our guns. We're not going to do that. So they declined. So he went and bought that 160 acres and created his own resort. And he's considered the San Bernardino's John Muir. And this is what Pinecrest looked like, which is very different from the log cabins that we saw earlier. This was full-blown Victorian, romantic. It's like the stuff that they built in the Adirondacks. It's full-blown romantic craftsman extravaganza. Now, the dam was completed in 1915. However, a 1913 lawsuit determined that the water in the newly formed reservoir of Little Bear Lake flowed naturally to the farmers on the desert side and not to the citrus growers. So, oh my, what are we going to do? So they decided, well, instead of doing a irrigation reservoir, we'll make it a private fishing club. And so that's where we see this private fishing resort, which became so popular that one year they actually had a riot because so many people wanted to go fishing. And they built this resort and cabins on the site of where Lake Arrowhead Village is now. And I'm going to fast forward now to the 1920s. This is a scene from Lake Arrowhead where the village currently is. And the guy who was the main driver of all of this, his name was James E. Mooney. He was from one of the guys from Ohio. And he owned a bunch of companies, but one in particular was the country's largest coffin maker. Does that look like a guy who had a coffin-making company? Anyway, he must have made a killing building coffins during the Spanish flu pandemic. But then, unfortunately, he also succumbed to Spanish flu. But he was already kind of old, so it's probably okay. He didn't have any kids. He never married. His heirs didn't want to have anything to do with any of the California properties. So they sold it for pennies on the dollar to an LA syndicate who planned to they said, okay, we got it so cheap, we can pour money into this, and we'll take it from a private fishing club into a luxury resort. And they raised the dam 31 feet, and it continued filling until 1923. And at that point, they changed it from Little Bear Lake to Lake Arrowhead. And this is an early photo of the new village that was built on the site, Little Bear Lake Resort. And as you can see, it doesn't look anything like those Victorian craftsman buildings looked. The new resort embodied a completely new type of architectural vision. Gone was the Victorian arts and crafts, and a Beaux-Arts attitude of creating an architecture which somehow reflected the region it was built took over. And they talk about that in a January 1923 article on Lake Arrowhead. And I took a screenshot here, and it says they thought that it was an uncongenial setting for Spanish and Italian type of building that was going on here in Palm Springs, all over Southern California. And they decided that English and Norman was more appropriate. And besides, it shed the snow better. So one of the first buildings they built was called the Clubhouse. And this was built on the far side of the lake. There were no roads. You could only get there by boat. And it was used as a place to literally wine and dine prospective buyers. Now, Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933. So what they did is there was a creek that ran alongside this, and when the sheriff came up the mountain, he had to get on a boat to get to this building. So they would have a series of mirrors that they could signal. So when they were having a party and the sheriff was coming, they could dump all the moonshine in the creek, and it was fine. Anyway, the name got changed from the Clubhouse to the North Shore Tavern sometime in the 1920s, and you wonder why. And there was also a connection to Palm Springs because they had seasonal workers. So they actually built a dormitory for the workers who summered in Arrowhead and lived in Palm Springs during the winter. Which brings us to one of the first Palm Springs connections I want to talk about. This house was designed for a Chicago publisher in 1924 and cost $20,000. The architect, Robert M. Finlayson, was a Palm Springs architect. In 1928, he sold it to May Ringe, her daughter Rhoda, and her daughter's husband, Merritt Adamson. Anybody know who the Adamsons were? City of Malibu. And they would come up here when they were trying to avoid the process server. But anyway, that's another story. So the Ringe Adamsons decided to do an addition, a little addition, which cost $20,000, which was the same amount of money that the original house cost. And Paul Williams was said to have also worked on this house later when Lon Chaney owned it. But I haven't seen any actual documentation for that, so I don't know if that's true. But here we are. There was an explosion of building during the 1920s, and then came the stock market crash in 1929. And although the 30s were marked by the throes of the Great Depression, it didn't affect Arrowhead very much, because movies were a great form of escapism. And Arrowhead was only, 87 miles from Hollywood? So it became a filming mecca. And building continued with both the most expensive house built on the lake and also the most famous, Schindler's Bonatti Cabin. Here's a village set that was built for the filming of several movies, and it was used in the filming of The Yearling, which was supposed to take place in Florida, but Arrowhead didn't have palm trees. So they brought up some palm trees from probably the Coachella Valley in pots and planted them for the filming, and then after the filming was done, they took them back down the mountain. Which brings us, just to show you the range of what was built, we find this house at one extreme. It was built in 1931 for the saltine cracker heiress Catherine Eiton. It cost over $120,000 to build. Now, here's a saltine cracker, and you can see the driveway is said to have been modeled after, it's supposed to look like saltine crackers. And it's rumored that this house was brought stone by stone from France, but only elements like the front door surround and some interior elements were actually brought over. It was built by William Lee Willey and his son, William Lee Willey, who came from a long line of artisans and architects dating all the way back to the 1700s. And they were all named William Willey. Anyway, here is the custom tile ceiling in the dining room, and it was based on scenes found in the 11th century Bayeux tapestry. And here's the living room, which included a pipe organ and a beautiful mural, probably painted by William Lee Willey Jr. Now, that was not really typical of what was going on. Not too many people had 120 grand during the Depression to design a house. More typical was this house. I don't know the cost, but it was at least $10,000 because all the lots in this particular subdivision had to cost a minimum of $10,000. It was built for the attorney O'Melveny, who was the attorney for the water rights for Lake Arrowhead. And it's nicely detailed, but fairly simple, except for this lovely carving of, one of those pesky squirrels that they needed to take care of. But there were a number of ways that people cut down on costs, and one of them was that the Arrowhead Company decided to open up new tracts where houses did not need to cost $10,000 to build. And here we see a house that was designed by Van Ivera Bailey. He worked for William Gray Purcell, and he was one of the Prairie School architects. And they worked together on this house here, the Purcell House, 1933 in Palm Springs. And in addition to working with Purcell, Bailey also worked with Richard Neutra. I'll talk a lot about Neutra in this talk. Now, another solution was let's use a prefab house. And there was a Sears store on the mountain in Cedar Glen, which is one of the little communities around the lake. And the guy who ran the Sears store built himself a Bellwood model. I haven't actually been able to locate it. I don't know if it still exists. I was told that it still existed in the 1980s. And this would have cost between $1,200 and $2,800. Another way to keep costs down was to do things really simple and do small additions or build adjacent buildings next to a main house. This house was designed in 1924, and in 1928, Curtis M. Willock bought it. And you go, well, who's he? Well, he was the designer of the world's first electric golf cart. And I'm sure they had some of these in Palm Springs, and it was so popular that in 1932, he built a chauffeur's quarters next door to his house. Fairly simple. It cost $1,000. And he used architect Styles O. Clements. And who's Styles O. Clements? If you know anything about LA architecture, he built some of the iconic buildings, Art Deco buildings. He did the Mayan Theater, Sampson Tire Factory, and the Atlantic Richfield Tower. He was also the head of the Architectural Committee, which approved all the designs in the 20s and 30s. Remember that. He approved all the designs. And he was trained at MIT and at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, in France. Again, remember that. Now, the chauffeur's quarters were later purchased by Cliff May. And he was a famed California modernist, best known for helping create the modern California ranch house. And he hired famed modernist landscape architect Tommy Dolliver Church to design these terraces. Cliff May designed the furniture you see here. By the fall of 1953, the Palm Valley Associates became the exclusive distributors of the prefabricated Cliff May Desert House. And it was a model home. There was a model home built either near or in the Thunderbird Country Club. And there were apparently over a dozen orders taken, but I wasn't able to find out where in Palm Springs. I think there's like 2 or 3 in the Palm Desert area. But Cliff May was so successful that he decided to purchase a larger home a couple houses down. And he sold the chauffeur's quarters to famed modernist architectural photographer Maynard Parker, seen here with his daughter, her husband, and his 3 grandchildren. This person on the end here, she's an architect working in Central California now. And fast forward to a couple of years ago, the owners who bought the house decided it was too small, too plain, and it didn't look like old Arrowhead, so they added a bunch of gingerbread to it. And then they said, well, why do we need those terraces? So they built this secondary garage, and then they built this house directly in front of that. So the Tommy Church terraces are completely gone. More typical was to try and design more economically in the prevailing French Norman style, such as this lakefront designed by Fusler and Herberger, 1934. And it was published, I believe, in Sunset Magazine, billed as an economical adaptation of a chalet-style house, comfortable and roomy, but not prohibitive in cost. And this house cost, the building permit shows that it cost $6,000 to construct. It was built by Victor Montgomery and then later owned by Olympian Buster Crabbe, better known as his role as Flash Gordon. But there were also innovators on the mountain. And here we have Rudolf Schindler. He designed what is considered the world's first modern A-frame, built for fellow Austrian Gisela Bonatti. The drawing states that the house was designed in 1934 during the height of unemployment during the Great Depression. But the building permit wasn't pulled until 1936, and it cost $4,000 to build. So that's $2,000 less than Flash Gordon's place, $2,000 more than the Sears catalog house. Now, this was not the first triangle house that Schindler designed. In 1924, he designed the Laura Davies house, commissioned in 1922. It is probably the first, but it was never built. And then he also designed the Mrs. M. Davis Baker house in Hollywood, also of 1923, but that too was never built. But I put this up here because I wanted to show the similarity between the Bonatti cabin and the M. Davis Baker house of 1923. Now, the Architectural Woods Committee at the time stipulated, and they still do, I believe, all new construction be French Norman design. This doesn't look like your typical French Norman design. Now, architectural historian Esther McCoy, and this is a direct quote, stated, quote, that the reason the design was approved was that none of the members of the Architectural Committee had ever been to Europe, and that Schindler convinced the committee to approve the design by showing them photos of steep-roofed Norman buildings, end quote. Well, that's a wonderful story, but I don't think it's exactly true, because do you remember Styles O. Clements, who was the chair who signed off on all the drawings and approved all the projects? He had lived in Paris, France, when he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. Even if he hadn't been present at the actual presentation, I can't imagine that he would not have known about the design and probably thought it was pretty cool. Well, the cabin burned in the 1960s and was rebuilt. It was pretty much the same, except they enclosed the garage and turned it into living space. Now, towards the end of the Great Depression, and immediately following the construction of the Bonatti House, we see such work as which was designed by celebrity architect Paul Revere Williams. Here's Paul Williams with his wife and a client in Lake Arrowhead. Now, Williams had a number of projects in Palm Springs. This is just a couple of the houses. He was designing as early as, 1922 in Palm Springs, but they were all Spanish. But when he came up to the mountains, he changed his style a little bit to be more appropriate. And his later work included the addition to the Palm Springs Tennis Club, the 1954 Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz house at the Thunderbird Country Club. And I'm told that Lucy and Desi also had a house on the mountain near Lake Arrowhead in Crestline. I don't know exactly where it was because apparently it has burned down. But in Lake Arrowhead, Williams' first project was a boathouse for aviator Thomas Hamilton, dating from 1937. It is said to have been modeled after an old boathouse on the Thames River in England. And here's an example of a Thames River boathouse and the blueprints of Hamilton's boathouse. It was designed as a party house because Hamilton lived across the lake, and it had a first floor float deck for the boats to dock. It had a pavilion deck, which was basically a party room, and then it had a room for sail storage and a bathroom. Architect MacDonald Beckett, the nephew of Welton Beckett, purchased the property from Hamilton. Beckett owned the property for a number of years before selling it to the Davis family, who hired architect H.B. Leidenfrost to do an extensive remodel. He kind of changed the look of the house, and he added, imagine there's another wing over here for the bedrooms. And that was done in 1980. Now, the current owners attempted to restore the house to be closer in intent to Williams' original vision, as seen in, this is what the house looks like now. At the time that the boathouse was built, Hamilton owned the entire peninsula, which is in pink here. And the original house that had bedrooms in it on the peninsula was designed for his two daughters in 1937, also by Paul Williams. And the house became known as the Sisters' House. It had a thatched roof, which I don't have a photograph of, but I have this one with the snow, so you can use your imagination and pretend that's thatching. And this is what the house looks like now. It was moved in the 70s from its original location close to the entrance of the property to its current lakefront location near the Hamilton Boathouse. It has been beautifully restored, and I found a newspaper article that said that Hamilton wanted his two daughters to learn the fundamentals of housekeeping, so they helped with the design and interior decorating of the house. And you can see some of Paul Williams' artistry in the design of this bedroom. Now, Hamilton also had Williams design a house for his guests, which was near the entry to the location of his property. Like the Sisters' House, it had thatched roof. Isn't that amazing? But after Hamilton built these two houses with the thatched roofs, he couldn't get fire insurance. I wonder why. Why would you need fire insurance in the mountains? So since he couldn't get fire insurance, he procured his own fire truck and built a garage to house his fire truck, and all the rest of the buildings on his property did not have thatched roofs. And the gatehouse went from having a shingle roof to a slate roof when it was moved in the 1970s, about a block away. This is taken from that porte cochere of the gatehouse looking back at the stables. It was built in two phases, one in 1937, another one in 1940, and it eventually turned into apartments. It's now a single-family house. Lore has it, the stables, the contractor got north and south mixed up. So this facade was originally supposed to face the lake, and it's on the opposite side. And I've heard that story from a couple of people. Here is a current view of one of the wings of the stables. Looking from the stables to the auxiliary building, the fire truck was housed down here below, and these have now been some condos. And here is Paul Williams, looking very dapper in a suit and hat, supervising the construction of the auxiliary building. And then there were larger projects. The Depression ended in, I think, 1938. And we had a few larger projects, such as the development of Snow Valley Ski Resort, which occurred in 1939 by Wallace Neff. And it's based on a Swiss chalet. And Neff also designed the Sun Valley, Idaho ski lodge in Idaho in 1940, the following year. Now, the original Snow Valley Lodge burned down in 1952, and unfortunately, I couldn't find a photograph of that original lodge, and it was rebuilt. The general form is the same, but it's much larger. It's 3 stories instead of 2 stories, and it doesn't appear to have any of the original detailing. I also once saw a picture of Wallace Neff on skis in Lake Arrowhead. I can't find that anymore. Anyway, Neff also, of course, built in Palm Springs, and here's a rendering of the Bourne Estate of 1933. And the largest of them all, the Arrowhead Springs Hotel. Now, this isn't in Lake Arrowhead proper, but it's on the road up the mountain, and you can see the Arrowhead here that Lake Arrowhead is named after. This is a natural formation. It's been there for thousands of years, and it points to a hot springs below here, which was used by the indigenous inhabitants as a healing place. And there were 3 hotels on this site. Before this hotel, they all burned down. And then in 1939, this new hotel with Paul Williams, Gordon Kaufman, and Dorothy Draper was built. And the hot springs water was also bottled. And in the 1930s, it was marketed as a juvenile water, healthy water for kids. Now I think it's the largest bottled water company in the state of California. So their marketing campaign worked. All those little kids grew up and are buying Arrowhead Springs water. And this was another one of their marketing campaigns. I know it isn't architecture, but it is design. This is 1936. But back to the hotel. The current structure was designed by Gordon B. Kaufman, Paul Williams, and Dorothy Draper. She did the interiors. Kaufman is probably best known for his work on the Hoover Dam. But in the Coachella Valley, it was the La Quinta Resort of 1926 that would be best known. Dorothy Draper was the founder of the United States' first interior design firm, and here are 2 shots of some work in Palm Springs entitled Palm Springs 1 and Palm Springs 2. Draper died in 1969, so my guess is these designs were by her firm with her name on it, because I don't think they had internet in 1969. But back to the hotel again. As you can see, the facade is very similar to many of the homes that Paul Williams built at this time in LA and Beverly Hills in what was called the Hollywood Regency style. And in fact, the very term Hollywood Regency appears to have originated with Dorothy Draper in the 1920s. The hotel was Hollywood's A-list favorite. Here's the front door, and it just exudes Hollywood glamour. And this is when you get into there's the entry and a bar off the entry, a fireplace in one of the lounges, and a corner of the main dining room. Draper's modern Baroque style is certainly on display here. I didn't know this, but when I was putting this lecture together, I found out that Dorothy Draper and Eleanor Roosevelt were cousins. Eleanor Roosevelt frequented the Arrowhead Springs Hotel, as did many celebrities. During World War II, it was turned into a naval hospital and served over 6,000 servicemen. It reverted to a hotel after the war until it was sold to the Campus Crusade for Christ as their world headquarters. It has since been sold to the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, who are in the process of restoring it. Now, although building continued during the Great Depression, essentially stopped dead, stopped cold during the war years. The few houses that were started in 1939 were typically completed after the war. Commercial contractor Ted R. Cooper started this house for himself in 1939, but it was completed after the war. Perhaps it is, since it wasn't a lakefront, or maybe he wanted to use this for his employees, the Coopers decided to build another very similar house on the North Shore, on the other side of the lake, close to the North Shore Tavern. And Ted R. Cooper's Windswept was started in 1944, but it was completed by 1948 when it graced the cover of the LA Times magazine. It's still owned by the family. And you can see the similarities between the White House and Windswept. And you might look at that and say, well, what's so modern? What's so special about this house? Well, the interiors were designed by Gustave Plocher. And the Plocher color system was one of the first commercially available color systems with removable cards in America. And Plocher's clients included Joan Crawford, Max Factor, John Lautner, Richard Neutra, Bullocks, Nordstrom, Sears and Roebuck, Dunn Edwards, Benjamin Moore, Ameritone. The list goes on and on. And it was based on the Ostwald color system, and much of Ostwald's work on the systemization of color was done in collaboration with the Deutscher Werkbund, and his work was influenced by that of Albert Munzel, who influenced Mondrian, other members of De Stijl, Paul Klee, and the Bauhaus School. So that's why that house is quite important. They still have the book that Plocher put together for the house. That brings us to the magnificent Obsession House. It was started before the war, but not completed until afterwards. It was designed by Kenneth S. Wing. He was a noted Long Beach architect. And case study architect Ed Killingsworth, before he became licensed, worked for Kenneth S. Wing. So this office, or this project, would have been in the office when Killingsworth started. I don't know if he worked on this or not, but he would probably have been familiar with this project. And Ed Killingsworth also worked in the Coachella Valley, and we see here the Marriott Desert Springs Hotel. Now, while the Hollywood crowd dominated much of the building in Arrowhead, aviators who benefited from the war also built a number of houses in Arrowhead. In fact, John Northrop built several, including one for his employees. It was designed by Pasadena architect Garrett von Pelt, and here are pictures from the archives at the Huntington of that house. And Van Pelt also had an office, a satellite office in Palm Springs, and John Clark and Albert Fry worked there and designed the buildings, but they weren't licensed. So Garrett von Pelt signed off on those. But I don't know how many of them were actually designed by John Clark and Albert Fry. Now, while the house itself was kind of traditional, Northrop was certainly on the cutting edge of design. Jack, as he was known, had a long history in Arrowhead. In 1924, he built the first sling lift on the mountain in what is now Snow Valley. And Here's the sling lift in Lake Arrowhead. In fact, you can see the lake in the back. This ski area was walking distance to the current village, and I think there was skiing in Arrowhead until the early 60s. He also designed an experimental boat, and of course what he's most famous for was his aircraft design. Another aviation pioneer was John Lockheed. He was the son of the founder of Lockheed Aircraft Corp., Alan Lockheed, and he had this small cabin designed and built for him in 1948 by Burbank architect Lucille Bryant Rapport. She was just one of 350 licensed architects in the United States at that time. And she made her name designing mid-century houses and apartment buildings in the San Fernando Valley during its 1950s building boom. And it was published in a 1948 article, LA Times article, on modern mountain cabins. And you can see just the corner of Schindler's Bonatti cabin right here. She got her architectural degree from University of Kansas, and then she moved to Southern California, became a junior partner at Harry Inge Johnston. She was then one of the chief designers at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And then she studied with Richard Neutra before establishing her own firm. And it's essentially, here's some photographs. It's essentially a one-room cabin. These are by Julia Schulman. And my favorite photo of the cabin. Julia Schulman had a way of framing photographs. You know, you'd hold a tree branch or whatever to frame, and I particularly like how he framed this photo. Which brings us to the 1950s. The year that Conrad Buff graduated from USC, he designed a small cabin for his parents. It was published in the home magazine, of course, of the LA Times. Conrad Buff, his father, noted artist who, along with his wife, Mary Buff, did illustrated children's books. And family friends included people like Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra. Here you can see the influence of Neutra and Schindler on this cabin. Now, I tried to find the cabin, and I found the lot, and it appears that the original two-bedroom cabin was replaced with this 6,000 square foot house in 2010. Maybe the cabin is someplace else on the property. I don't know. I haven't gone there. I can hope. Anyway, we've mentioned Neutra a number of times, but haven't shown any projects. Famed Austrian-American modernist Richard Neutra also built in the San Bernardinos near Lake Arrowhead, but not actually in Lake Arrowhead. Here is a house he built in Running Springs, about 7 miles east. Here's the living room, the kitchen, and one of the bedrooms. Neutra also designed in the Coachella Valley, and here's the 1937 Grace Miller House, and of course, his iconic Kaufman House of 1946. Now, the 50s and 60s are sometimes referred to as the golden age of fantasy, and you have Disney movies such as these in the early 50s. And I'm trying to figure out why this phenomena happened, and I think, you know, after people went through World War II, and then they came home and there was peace and prosperity. But 6 weeks before Disneyland opened, in 1955, Glenn Holland, he was a local Crestline guy, opened Santa's Village on land leased from the Hank family. He opened up 2 more Santa's Villages, one in Dundee, Illinois, which I think is still open, and another in Santa Cruz, California, making Santa's Village the world's first franchise theme park. The design build team was Putty Hank. He was a general contractor and an engineer trained at UC Berkeley. A team of local artisans and craftsmen created the whimsical Santa's Village. There was no architect. And here's Putty Hank. He often went as Santa Claus, and his wife, who was known as the Lollipop Lady. And here's one of the rides. The franchise went bankrupt in 1970, and ownership reverted to the Hank family. They expanded the park, introducing more rides, horseback riding, and a fantasy forest with nature trails. In 1998, the Hank family sold the park, and after extensive work and restoration, the new owners reopened it in 2016 as Sky Park Santa's Village. And in addition to the restored rides and buildings, they also added attractions to make it into an outdoor adventure park. Here's a candy store as it was originally designed and after renovation. I guess they kind of made it a little bit more tasteful or something, not quite as fantastic. It's still quite nice. And Santa's workshop. Now, Cinderella houses came into fashion in Southern California during the early 50s. The first supposedly designed and built by John Vandruff and Downey in 1953. He credits his wife for the name. She supposedly told him that the houses were fit for Cinderella. This fantasy variation of a California ranch house style became so popular that it could be found in places like the San Fernando Valley, Orange County, Santa Barbara, and beyond. Perhaps the most elaborate of these Cinderella houses would be the Madonna Inn in San Luis Obispo. Now, with it so popular, it's not a surprise that Cinderella houses also found their way to Lake Arrowhead. Here are two examples. They would typically have a darker color on the house, and the gingerbread would be painted a contrasting color to accentuate its decorative quality. In 1960, the Turf Club, which had owned the lake and properties and basically used it as a tax write-off, they would donate parcels like to the Boy Scouts or to build a hospital. Tax laws changed. So the Lake Arrowhead Development Company purchased the lake, and as the name suggests, they developed it. A whole bunch of new tracts were formed. And we start to see designs such as this. This house was designed by David Fowler for his mother 6 years after his graduation from USC in 1960. And I read that he designed several houses in Lake Arrowhead, but I haven't found them yet. Here's a view showing the location of his small house and of how it sits in the forest. A view from the interior. Another view. You can see Frank Lloyd Wright's influence in these projects. And a detail of the roof. Fowler's most famous house is this house he also designed for his mother called Ridgetop. It can be seen in the 2001 film The Fast and the Furious as the undercover headquarters of the LAPD. And again, you see Frank Lloyd Wright's influence in the house. And in, I believe, 2002, a year after it was filmed, it was torn down to make room for what is now the second largest home in LA, the Pritzker Estate. Now, Lloyd Wright also built in Lake Arrowhead. He's the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was trained as a landscape architect by the Olmsted brothers, and then he worked with his dad developing concrete textile block buildings in LA. He worked on the landscape of the Panama, California Expo in San Diego in 1915, and the second and third band shells for the Hollywood Bowl. Later, he worked with Rudolph Schindler and his father on the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo and on Barnsdale Park. In 1920, he went off on his own, and by 1922, he was production manager at Paramount Studios, designing 12th century village sets for the Douglas Fairbanks version of Robin Hood. Buildings by Lloyd Wright in Palm Springs include the Oasis Hotel. I think only the tower exists. And the largest collection of Lloyd Wright buildings in the world, which is the Institute for Mental Physics. It was on tour this Modernism week. And this is what his design in Lake Arrowhead looked like. It's a tiny house, but you can see its expressive organic forms. It seems like it's just growing out of the woods. After falling into disuse for many years and, I quote, returned to the cows, the original 9-hole golf course was expanded to 18 holes after Jules Berman and the Lake Arrowhead Development Company purchased the lake. In 1963, the back 9 was carved out of the surrounding mountain, and a new clubhouse was commissioned to be designed by Richard L. Dorman. It's a dramatic mid-century modern A-frame called by some the largest A-frame in the world at the time of construction. It was published in Arts and Architecture. Here's a photograph from a postcard soon after completion in 1964. And Dorman's work, it said, unifies exterior, interior, and landscape in what he termed total design. These photographs show what the clubhouse looked like when Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Dean Martin, and Tony Bennett attended the opening of the club, and some interior shots. The club was remodeled a number of years ago and reflect a more rustic, less mid-century modern style. The structure is so strong that even, antler chandeliers look okay in it, at least I think. Richard Dorman also designed in the Coachella Valley, including 20 projects in the desert communities. And here's the Salton Bay Yacht Club, which was 1960, which has been lost to the bulldozer. This house was designed by Fred McDowell in 1965. He was a USC graduate, and he worked for, who do you think he worked for? Richard Neutra, like most of these guys up here. It was featured in the LA Times Home magazine in 1966, and McDowell said, I want to do something like a prow of a boat opening up to the view, so I started with that element and worked backwards into the house. Houses with large A-frame gables on all 4 sides and a floor plan which is rotated 45 degrees beneath the roof eave are sometimes referred to as Flying W houses. I've been told that there's at least a dozen Flying W's on the mountain. Interiors were designed by Pat Maeda. She was an interior designer artist and a member of the Scripps College Fine Arts Foundation, and she incorporated accessories designed by members of the Claremont Art Group. And it was photographed again by Julia Schulman. There's a sign out front that calls this house Ventanas del Lago, or Spanish for lake windows. You can see the plan rotated at a 45 here. And here we see why these houses are called Flying W's, because it looks like it's ready to take off. And in Architizer magazine, they say one of the defining features of the Googie style is upswept roofs, making the building look like it was ready to fly away. Well, Googie architecture is typically referred to for commercial work, but maybe, I don't know, could we call this Googie style? Well, some of the roofs on these so-called Flying W's were more exaggerated than others. This Flying W was designed for comedian Shecky Greene in 1967. Shecky Greene also had a house in Palm Springs. Anyway, I had never heard of Flying W's until I started doing this research, and I heard from at least 3 or 4 people saying, hey, we've got a Flying W house. Okay. I asked Ellen Hess if he had ever heard of a Flying W house. He said he hadn't heard of it, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Here is the interior, and you can see how the prow opens up to the lake view. And this particular house is designed around a circular stair fireplace. Here's another Flying W, and I think this one's particularly interesting, and they are restoring it. The inverted corner here is kind of interesting. And if you want to stay in a Flying W, this one rents on Airbnb, as does this one. And I called up and I said, tell me everything you know about your house. And so this last owner said, well, we know that it was designed by John Gerard because we have plans and a rendering. And so I looked up, well, who is John Gerard? He worked for Stephen Ehrlich on a number of projects from 1984 to 1998. And I found a monograph on his work, and there is yet another Flying W in that book, designed for Lake Arrowhead, 1967. And you can clearly see that he was inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright. But this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gables, which is different than the 4 gables you see on most of them. And then just driving around, I found this Flying W. And what is interesting of this one is this entire corner is glazed. So when you look from this angle, you see directly through. I mean, the corner of the house just disappears. What I noticed about that house when I first saw the house, because I didn't know what a Flying W was, is I had noticed the edge of the roof, and it reminded me of this house designed by builder W. Keith Duncan in 1968. It's not a Flying W, but has a similar prow-like corner under the gable. And I find the detailing on this really interesting. He took like a 2x6 or 2x8 and cut it one direction, and then flanked it with 1x's on either side to create this kind of detail on the ends of the beams, and then used the roof itself as a decorative element, which I think is really kind of nice. And then as I was driving, I was thinking about the talk and are there any Flying W's in Palm Springs? And I was going along the 10 and I noticed this house. This is more exaggerated when you see it from the 10 freeway. I said, oh, I just found another Flying W here in Palm Springs. But when I look at it, it has 1, 2, 3 gables and not the 4 gables like most of the Arrowhead houses have. Then I found this house, also published in the Home magazine, made the cover. It was designed in 1966 by the same guy who designed the Arrowhead Country Club. I'm not sure where the location is, but I think it's this house. And normally A-frames have a post down the center, and this one doesn't, and this one doesn't. So maybe that's the house. And again, driving by, I find interesting houses, and I always admired these condos over by the country club, and I found out that they were designed by Palm Springs architect Bill Cody. And they were advertised in the LA Times, and I'll read to you what the descriptor was. The villas offered 2- and 3-bedroom units, complete with resort amenities of room service, maid service, continuous exterior maintenance, golf club and lake privileges, with prices starting at $39,000. I'm sure those units are not $39,000 anymore. Anyway, Michael Black was also a prominent Palm Springs modernist who trained at USC and then later taught design at SciArc. He designed this house for his family, and it was published in 1971 in Time magazine. And we see some images from that. Michael Black designed a number of buildings in the Coachella Valley, and if you're from Palm Desert, you probably recognize this bank. Now, the Monte Corona is an interesting complex. It was built in 1966 for the LA Teachers Association, and they later sold it to the California Teachers Association. And it was designed by Frank Coppage of Fleming and Coppage Architects. And it's organized around a circular central building with a radiating A-frame roof. Here's an ad from 1966 and some postcards. You can see the residential units on the bottom with the conference center and what it looked like during its heyday. It was sold to Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, which turned it into a Bible college and conference center. They moved to a larger facility in '96 at Murrieta Hot Springs, and then they renovated and reopened it as a Calvary Chapel Twin Peaks. Now, the Teachers Association also had a condo project built in 1970, also designed by Frank Coppage. And you can see here, this is the exterior row. It almost looks Wrightian. And this is the middle row, and then this is the recreation building. And as the circumference shrinks, the roof pitch gets steeper. And the pool is the same kind of funky design as in the Monte Corona. And this is what the interiors look like. Now, I know this is what you've all been waiting for. Liberace's house. And I know it's a fuzzy picture, but I was lucky enough to find one of his fans, one of his many fans out front. And I grabbed my phone and took a picture. Anyway, it's the only photo I have with a bear. Now, although the CC&R state the house be French Norman, hey, this was the 1970s, and they took quite a few liberties with its interpretation. Here we have Liberace in his boat. And being Liberace's home, you had to the candelabra. And there's 2 candelabra on either side of the entry gate. And the living room, you know, traditional Arrowhead living room with a beamed ceiling and a big fireplace with stylized Gothic arches and sliding glass doors. I guess that's one way of detailing it. And the principal bedroom, of course, it had a chandelier. And the kitchen. These are really kind of interesting beams. The former owner, I was talking with her, and she absolutely hated the persimmon color tile. So I have no idea if, I haven't been in the house in several years, so I don't know if that's still there. But I do know that the bathroom with its, I think this is flocked wallpaper, that has been torn out. Unfortunately, you know, it's now a black and white bathroom. And here's a detail of some interesting Mannerist beams in the back and a view from the lake. I don't think an architect was involved in this project. I could be wrong. And here's Liberace's house in Palm Springs. Now, there was a local San Bernardino architect. His name was David Hatfield. He graduated from UC Berkeley in 1966, and he designed this unmanned fire station on Highway 73 that goes around the lake. And he taught architecture at San Bernardino Valley College for a number of years, and he said that his designs were inspired by the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, Raphael Soriano, and Bruce Goff. I was amazed when I saw these pictures of his own house, overlooking San Bernardino on the mountain near the Arrowhead Springs Hotel. He built his own home, and he started construction on it in 1973. These are the only photos I could find. I called his son, and he said he didn't have anything better. These are from a newspaper article. He built the house in $100 increments, and the total cost came in under $20,000. Much of his designs were experimental, and he kind of got into trouble with the city of San Bernardino for some of his designs because they weren't sure that they met code. But his son said he would go out there and help his dad on the weekends build the house. And you can see a loft overlooking the hot tub. And here's the current state of the house. You can just make out the glass roof. You can't get very close to it. I'm not sure it's in really great condition, but I think that's a pretty cool looking house. Now, there were also some interesting modernist designs that continued into the 1980s, such as this house designed by Taylor Hudson out of San Francisco in 1981. Former Ice Valley star Carol Probst and her husband Walter commissioned this 12,000 square foot house, and their winter home is, I think Carol Probst still lives in Indian Wells. And it was designed with entertainment in mind. The Probst hosted numerous dignitaries, including Bob and Dolores Hope and Gerald Ford. That's not exactly typical of Arrowhead houses, but it is quite spectacular. It features 2-story high windows overlooking the lake, and the interiors have been described as retro Austin Powers interiors. And there's extensive use of lucite. Sorry, that's the only photo I had to show the lucite furniture. And the bathroom even has a 2-story window in it. And I'm told that the shower curtains originally had sequins all over them, which the family affectionately dubbed the Liberace bathroom. And here's the guest bedroom where Bob and Dolores Hope stayed and Gerald Ford stayed. Not together, but separately. And it's called the Blue Room because of the blue silk wallpaper and the blue onyx fireplace. Carolyn Walter also founded and built the Lake Arrowhead Ice Castle International Training Center, bringing Olympic caliber skating to the mountain. It was designed by architect Robert Kite. There was a massive snowstorm which collapsed the roof of the public ice skating rink, but the office complex, as you see here, still stands. Now, also in the 1980s, John Lautner designed this resort for Lake Arrowhead, but unfortunately it was never built. Models and renderings exist at the Getty. And I put these two slides up. This is Arrowcrest. He liked to use rock outcroppings and things, and you see that here with the Elrod house, 20 years earlier. Lautner also designed the Bob and Dolores Hope house in 1979. And by the 1990s, kind of the fervor for modernist design died down, and a notable exception is this house, designed by Buff and Hensman. Now, Conrad Buff died in 1989, and Hensman died in 2002. So this probably was completed under the direction of Don Hensman. So Lake Arrowhead bookmarks the career of Buff and Hensman, and it shows sort of how their style developed over time. And Buff and Hensman also built in Palm Springs. As the millennium approached, an all-out revival of old Arrowhead style begins to take place. And I designed this house for my father in 1998 when I was in partnership with my college roommate. And the design is true to the Arrowhead style, which is eclectic, and it incorporated French Norman design, craftsman, and fin de siècle Northern European design. And here's some of the details of the interior. And it had colors and materials mimicking the colors and textures of the forest. Now, the house has two main facades, the street facade, which I showed, and the lake facade shown here. And this is a tower that's modeled after a 1904 tower designed by Finnish architect Ilja Saarinen. And this relationship of a great room and tower is probably the first usage of that combination on the lake. Now, a return to Old Arrowhead continues into the 2000s. And this property was once owned by Beach Boy Brian Wilson. It's located directly across from where the village is. And it was built by the same contractor who built our home, who would take our plans home with him to study. And I'm told that by a neighbor that the woman wanted to design, and so here's the great room and the tower. Now, I don't know if that's true. My ego would like to believe that. But anyway, this is still a great house. And it is a striking example of the work of designer David Abbott dating from 2000. He gained popularity in the 1990s and 2000s for his fanciful storybook French Norman designs, replete with extensive detailing and half-timbering both inside and out. This is just one of the examples of his many houses in the area. He passed away in 2020, but the legacy of his projects live on as a continuation of the old Arrowhead style first introduced in 1922. Many of Dave Abbott's houses were built by contractor Ron Dolman, who designed quite a few of the houses himself, such as this house called Belmason. This is the entry house and the main house beyond. And here's a smaller house named Toad's Cottage. When I was talking with Ron, he said that he likes his designs to express an element of whimsy. And even the name, Toad's Cottage, expresses that attitude. These were designed in the early 2000s. This is in the late 2000s. This 11,000 square foot house was designed for Disney illustrator Glenn Keane and his wife. It replaced a much smaller house designed by Reginald Johnson that was published in Architectural Digest in 1934. And there's an exceptional attention to detail found throughout. Of note is the stonework crafted by a local artisan on the mountain. He was a native of Stuttgart, and his name is Marcel Mackler, who I've been told worked on the restoration of the Notre Dame Cathedral prior to this recent burning. Now, both the owner and the architect gave careful consideration of what it means to tear down a historic property, but ultimately they created this new structure, which I think is respectful of the architectural tradition and gives a convincing interpretation of an authentic French Norman structure. Here's, in the old Arrowhead tradition, there's a two-story great room, fireplace. What is interesting is the fenestration. It has big windows on both sides. That would not have been done in the 1930s. And the house gets its inspiration from the Chateau de Fleur of 1931. And you can see they even copied the umbrellas. Bringing us to the last historical house. It was originally built in 1924. One of the first houses on the lake. They called it Totem Pole Lodge because they had a totem pole. And the owner, it's interesting, he was a lumber guy, and he lost his eyesight dynamiting tree stumps. So there's a bunch of ropes all over the property, or there were, to prevent him from falling down the slope and into the lake. And in 2008, Totem Pole Lodge was extensively remodeled by local Lake Arrowhead architect John Lyles. And according to Lyles, and I quote, "The Great Western Lodges and Bernard Maybeck's early work were a great influence on my practice." Here's a view from the lake, and you can clearly see the old Arrowhead-style eclectic mix here. This was something that early 20th century architects had hoped would eventually happen. There was a lot of talk about Darwin's theories of evolution and that the historical styles and modern styles would eventually merge to create its own thing. And I think we see that in Lake Arrowhead. This is definitely a contemporary house, and yet it fits in perfectly well with the traditional architecture up there. And this will be the last house. This brings us close to the present time. My husband noticed this project in one of the architectural journals, and it has won several prestigious national awards. It was designed for an artist, and the architect, Edward Augusta, said that he was inspired by the roof and long elevation of the North Shore Tavern and Schindler's A-frame, two of the most notable buildings on the mountain. And the description states it's conceived of as a California chalet for the 21st century. And it's not surprising that the national jurors would love this house. The images are really compelling. But unlike Schindler's architectural committee, who supposedly had never been to Europe, I am almost certain that none of the national jurors had ever been to Arrowhead, much less heard about Arrowhead, and they weren't familiar at all of what the culture and architectural setting of Arrowhead is. And I say this because apparently the Architectural Design Committee wasn't quite as impressed as the national jurors were. And to his horror, the architect told me that the Architectural Committee suggested that he add some gingerbread, and they'd consider approval. Needless to say, the client sold the property, and the house was never built. So you might ask, what is the current state of architecture on the mountain, and what does the future hold? I ran across this Facebook page, and I cracked up. But I think this Facebook poster kind of says it all. I almost missed my turn yesterday as the house I use as a landmark for the past 22 years was painted completely black. I could not believe it. I might go back and gawk at it again. I was reminded of the Eddie Murphy movie, Beverly Hills Cop, where the character moved from Detroit to LA and just cracked up at everything he saw. Happy New Year! The Facebook poster noticed something that I notice, is that there's a new design trend on the mountain all over Arrowhead where houses are painted completely black and everything inside the house is painted completely white. Aesthetically, this looks pretty cool. But it feels strange to me that cabins that I know don't have modern insulation or double-paned windows are being turned into heat collectors. And it's not surprising that the demand for AC in Lake Arrowhead has skyrocketed. Not necessarily from painting the buildings black per se, but the temperatures do seem to be getting warmer. And AC on the mountain was not something anybody ever thought about putting in when I was growing up. So here are some examples of before and after, how they have freshened up the cabins. This is a 1930s cabin, and here's some more contemporary ones. Looks really nice. But I would like to end, and I bet you're all happy about that, with this photo from 1926. And as I said, I don't really know what the future is going to hold, but one thing I think will be important going forward is embodied in this old photo from 1926. It was taken at the end of the first conservation run from LA to Lake Arrowhead. Conservation run? What is that? Well, it was a contest that was set up to see which 3 automobiles, and I quote, the least amount of gasoline, oil, and water to drive from the Automo Club in LA at Adams and Figueroa to Lake Arrowhead. And the winner was determined by the following formula. The total weight of the car in ton times the number of miles driven divided by the number of gallons of gasoline consumed, and the result was in ton miles per gallon of gasoline. Vehicle weight, including the driver and no more than 4 passengers and 100 pounds of luggage. The water tanks, gas, and oil was measured at the beginning and at the end to determine who was the winner. Could you imagine what would happen if contests were held like this every year to see which new house was built the most energy efficient way, and have the public look as happy as these people look in this photo from 1926. I can't really tell if they look happy, but I'm going to assume they do. Anyway, I hope you enjoy my talk, and sorry it ran so long. Wow, I didn't lose everybody. That's great. Any questions? No? Thank you very much for coming.